authored Moral Injury After Abortion, Exploring the Psychospiritual Impact on Catholic Women, edited The Art of Spiritual Care Across Religious Difference, and also, even more recently, co-edited Reframing Trauma, a Psychospiritual Theory and Theology. Three of those books are or have been at the table there for you to browse and maybe to acquire. Jill, we are delighted that you accepted our invitation to be with us here, so we'll listen to you now.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much to Reverend Dr. Dan Chopani, President of International Association for Spiritual Care, to all the founding members of the IASC, as well as to the board members and all the institutions that have facilitated this conference taking place today. The title of my remarks is Reframed Psychospirituality of Trauma in a Diseased World. And my own remarks are influenced by a number of people, but I wanted to call some out today. We are formed by, with, and in communities. And for this particular project, some of my community partners contributed to this book, Reframing Trauma. But the way that the book came about was we approached Kirk Bingaman, who is editor-in-chief of Pastoral Psychology, and said, well, we have this idea that we want to do this special issue. And he got on board. And after we did that, we said, we have this idea that we want to redo some aspects of this special issue. And I reached out to Yvonne Hawkins, who's also here today. So we want to make it into a book, and she got on board. And so not just the ideas of the project itself, but also from the beginning to to what it is today, I've continuously wrestled with these people and be formed by them. So thank you. I want to organize this talk into three movements. First, to consider and reconsider how we define trauma. And Dr. Peterson spoke about this morning some. Then to challenge some of the traditional theologies of trauma and to try on theologies that acknowledge how trauma and resilience co-occur. And then finally, to acquire a theoretical and practical tools, practices for hope and healing, resilience and resistance in caring for what I will call stress trauma. So the first movement, reframing how it is that we define trauma. And we're approaching everything from this perspective of spiritual care as resistance because we are living in a diseased world. And for the last 6 years, I've been teaching mostly undergraduate students at Loyola University Maryland. And one of the uniquenesses and gifts of people in Generation Z is that they say it's okay to not be okay. And we all know this, right? We're spiritual caregivers. It's okay not to be okay, but we are not okay. And I think last night from Dr. Cooper White, we heard reasons we are not okay. And from Dr. Crumpton this morning and Dr. Peterson, we know it. But I want to open my remarks with some thoughts that Dr. Jan Holton and I shared in the book Reframing Trauma. It sets the stage for how we think about the need to both expand and refine what trauma means today. Perceptions of trauma in US culture, and arguably across the world, employ a hyper-focused lens that problematizes individual symptoms and behavior and resists any shift in our gaze. In the face of blatant forms of violence and aggression that seem ever present, especially for people living on the margins, this focus may not seem unreasonable. But to examine the cultural pervasiveness of trauma as a concept, we have to pull back into a much wider lens. And there, on the periphery, are lurking shadows. These shadows are the legacies of colonialism and capitalism that have shaped the world, along with the norms, expectations, and injuries with which we contend today. And these shadows, they inform our religious, political, and cultural beliefs and practices, and they affect individuals and communities differently based upon their proximity to power and privilege. But nonetheless, we're all impacted by these realities. So these shadows, including the shadows of colonialism and capitalism, they're only seen relative in location to light and our relative location. So those who are most privileged, metaphorically those who sit at high noon, that shadow can all but disappear, allowing them the possibility to never acknowledge its reality. But for so many others, most of those who inhabit the globe, the light reveals these lurking realities, the effects of oppression and greed. It's a world on fire by their continuing legacy. Now, whether or not it's the chaos from colonialism and capitalism that's more prevalent today, or merely that we just can't ignore its impact, it's a matter of debate. But it's difficult to ignore the conflict and threat, armed and otherwise, that's reverberating across the globe, whether as efforts to reclaim domination or in resistance to it. We are overwhelmed. We're overwhelmed, and the increasing environmental and political ambiguities, not to mention those natural to the course of human life, that continually stir anxieties that we're ill prepared to tolerate. And this inability to tolerate ambiguity leaves us grasping for ways to name what lurks behind these feelings. Pastoral theologian Ryan Lamoth reminds us that we cannot ignore this global macro view because, quote, suffering and care are inextricably bound to political and economic realities. And failure to recognize the impact of these forces leaves us more likely to collude unwittingly with these forces that lead to harm, instead of devising interventions that are aimed at resisting and changing these forces and structures. This complicity can magnify our suffering. It adds to our sense of confusion and that sense of being overwhelmed. Now, Jan and I wrote those words 2 years ago. Imagine how much truer they seem today. We did not have a crystal ball to see what would be coming, but we knew already we were overwhelmed. We're exponentially overwhelmed today. We're living in a diseased world. So when I use this word dis-ease to describe the world today, I'm drawing on the work of Alan Hugh Cole Jr. and his book, Be Not Anxious, Pastoral Care of Disquieted Souls. And he refers to dis-ease as a lack of harmony in our relationship with self, with others, with creation, and for those in the Abrahamic traditions, with God. And Cole focuses much more on individual, personalized experiences of dis-ease, but we know this isn't an individual phenomenon. It's a collective experience shared by all humans, by all species, by the planet. And in any given day, this dis-ease in the world is significant. It's palpable to overwhelm. These quotes, these headlines from the Associated Press are just from the last few weeks of July. And we see natural disasters and flooding. We see the taking away of rights of transgender individuals. We see immigration, all of this playing out on the daily, moment to moment. So we're brought to this question: if everything is trauma, is anything? Because as we reflect on the dis-ease in the world today, it's easier to begin to any overwhelm by us, by any species, by the planet, as trauma. But the use of this term trauma to describe the overwhelm of personal distress has become so ubiquitous that even the New York Times opinion pieces are saying, if everything is trauma, is anything? So much like depression and anxiety, it's just become this catch-all term for distress. And in an age where extraordinary events are seemingly outcompeting themselves, our idioms of distress have narrowed to the point where anything distressful can be called traumatic. This is where the paradox comes into play that Jan and I have played with, which is, if unnamed and unexamined, the imprint of stress and trauma not only shapes our lives as individuals and communities, but it continues and cascades through generations. We heard some of that. But when we name these experiences as traumatic without any kind of discernment, our distress can be increased, and we don't access the growth and the wisdom that's needed to navigate these natural ambiguities of life, as well as those that are impressed upon us. So Dr. Peterson already foreshadowed, I'm going to play a bit with how do we define trauma? How do we think about stress, trauma, PTSD, intergenerational trauma? And this is important because this language informs how we construct, narrate, and understand our experiences. So Maxwell Alejandro Frost is a 28-year-old representative in the state of Florida. He's the first Gen Z member of Congress. And he said, our generation, meaning Generation Z, has been born into a lot of trauma and a lot of civil unrest around people being frustrated with things. And I think because of that, our generation naturally thinks about things in a bit of a different way. Now, assertions such as these are attempts to witness, to honor the suffering that comes from living in a diseased world. But the unintended consequence of such statements can be that everything experienced is trauma, right? All distress is traumatic. So we all know stress. You've all experienced it psychologically, physiologically. This is just a definition that you can read or assume you know, which you do. But it's essential to remember that not all stress is distress. And one thing I want to highlight is concept of eustress that we often overlook. Eustress is a positive stress response, and we need it for optimal performance. It's a type of stress that results from challenging but enjoyable and worthwhile tasks. So I'm a runner. It's good to be a little stressed before a marathon. It's good to be a little stressed before speaking in front of a room today, right? That's eustress. I can metabolize it. I can work through it. It's positive. But distress is different. And what's different between these is subjective to our interpretation. So Catherine Dolmas and Carolyn Hilarski, who are social work scholars, I'm going to reference their research again. They stated that, quote, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima may be a trauma-producing event, a military victory, or a divine retribution, depending on the individual's attribution and perception of the experience. Our perception matters. So while distress and trauma can produce the same physiological responses, maybe hypertension or migraines, the acute and long-term effects of trauma are not the same as those of stress, whether distress or eustress. We have many definitions of trauma that are floating around, and this is just one. But when we consider reframing it, it's essential to remember that all aspects of creation, not limited to humans, endure disturbing experiences and terrible events. Sudden deaths, earthquakes, the like. But not every terrible event is traumatic simply because it's distressing. And even experiences like threatened death or serious injury, sexual violence, these may not be experienced as traumatic. But there are diffuse and persistent injuries that many humans endure. Racism, eco-violence, myriad socio-political and interpersonal injuries. These are all the seeds of disease, and they continuously injure individuals and communities. And maybe these are in some way more aptly defined as trauma than some of the things that we say are traumatic. Here's where we enter into the DSM's classic definition of post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is essential, right? We need these biomedical definitions. We need to understand what it means for diagnosis and for treatment. But it's necessarily limited and narrow. We remember, probably most of you in your training have heard about the emergence of this coming from shell shock, right? And when veterans returned and how we came upon this construct of PTSD. And the DSM-5 TR made shifts in how they understood trauma. They recognized aspects of intergenerational trauma, aspects of what it means to witness or have secondary trauma, but not be immediately exposed. But what's happened is that the medicalization of distress, while it was really probably well-intended, it's all been perpetuated by colonialism and capitalism. And so it's all tied up in perpetuating the disease of the world. So over 20 years ago, psychiatrist and philosopher Patrick Bracken argued against what he termed the trauma industry. And biomedical conceptualizations of trauma, what happens is that they reify universal truths about terrible events, positing that the mind, regardless of whose mind, will process such events in the same way. But not all human autonomic nervous systems function the same. And we know that meaning making is highly subjective and contextual. So the movement for global mental health and contemporary psychological aid to refugees exemplifies these problems that Bracken raised regarding the medicalization of distress. Humanitarian psychiatry has over the last 20 years exported the Western medical model of PTSD and the consequent dependence on language of trauma to the world. Now, interestingly, there's very often an absence of an indigenous word for trauma in many cultures, even though we would assume, for example, the South Sudan, who has been engaged in some level of conflict for decades or longer, would have its own term, but it does not. Rather, as with Arabic words and cultural concepts that have been subsumed into tribal languages, PTSD has likewise been imported to describe specific clinical symptoms of trauma. And it's difficult to believe that people who have been at war for decades would not have their own words to describe what's considered to be the biomedical model of a universal human response. But that's because it's not universal. So the medicalization of distress and the proliferation of the trauma industry are also present in how, in the United States, refugees are accepted for asylum. Now, this is all happening under the Trump administration in a very different way than it was prior. But refugees are required to show evidence of trauma. One, through a psychiatric assessment, but also through photographs of wounds and sources of documentation for what they've endured. And this demonstrates not only the medicalization of distress, but also the politicization of it. Because it's not without some degree of irony that we only accept asylum seekers who are trauma victims and can document that with this medical model when we fail to acknowledge the BIPOC experience in the United States, right? Individuals who have lived here for many generations have the greatest experience of racism and violence and ongoing uncertainty. But that's not legitimized as trauma because it doesn't fit within this medical model, right? So, who has the power to determine what is trauma? We move then to intergenerational trauma, which is another form of trauma. And the prevalence of it is arguably greater among traditionally marginalized populations, which means it's often overlooked. And so the intergenerational trauma is defined as the transmission of trauma or its legacy in a form of psychological consequence of an injury or attack, poverty, and so forth, from the generation experiencing the trauma to subsequent generations. It's believed that this is epigenetic, and I'll say more about how this is transmitted later. But the trauma can be experienced by older generations and then is translated into a genetic adaptation that can be passed on to successive generations. With these definitions in mind, stress, trauma, PTSD, intergenerational trauma, we turn to the work of Dalmas and Hilarski to reframe this understanding. They sought to help people to articulate stress, trauma, and crisis in distinctive ways. We don't incorporate crisis into this work, but what they help to show is that there is a unique relationship between stress and trauma. And that uniqueness is because while we're apt to say that events are traumatic, events are not traumatic, events just are. What happens is we have a response. The response can be stress or distress, or the response can be trauma, but the event is just the event. So Dolmas and Hilarski say, to describe both the event and the response as trauma is circular reasoning. So let me give you a very kind of silly example here. If you were to tell me, this morning my dog snuck out the front door as I was leaving and darted across the street just as a cyclist was passing our house. Before I could even open my mouth to shout, they'd collided. Now, in a room full of pastoral and spiritual caregivers, we would all respond very empathetically, right? And we might say something like, oh my, that sounds so stressful. Oh my goodness, that sounds very traumatic, right? We would be exaggerating a little bit, but it makes sense to describe the event as stressful or to describe the event as traumatic. The event is neither, right? The event just is. It's a very Buddhist way of thinking. There's no innate stress or trauma in your dog being hit by a cyclist or your cyclist being hit by a dog. It just is. But factors like personality, resilience, social support, these all are going to influence your perception of the event. So if you're resilient, you see yourself as capable, you have a good vet, and you have a cell phone to call 911 for the cyclist, you might perceive this as a moderately distressing event. But if you generally struggle and you view yourself as incapable, and perhaps you lack resources, and you might be inclined to think that the cyclist is going to sue you, then you might think this is traumatic, right? None of this is about our actual capabilities or resources. It's all about our perception of what they are. So because stress and trauma are about perceptions and not actual events, it's really complicated to think about what causes stress and trauma. And it helps us to reframe even this, because the most widely recognized cause of stress trauma remains exposure to actual or threatened death. And that's essential for the DSM's diagnosis of PTSD. But when we view trauma as part of this stress trauma continuum, we can see other causes even like communication. So there was a study following the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, and 41 families were observed to see how trauma was transmitted between mothers and their teenage children who had not consciously experienced the genocide. And one 52-year-old mother participant in the study said, the genocide has more effects because, for example, when a child asks you for money, I tell him, if the genocide had not taken your father, I would now be relieved, and you would address your problems to him. Sometimes it happens that I say this by accident, but I feel that I'm not fair to them because I shouldn't even say it since they were too young and don't even know what happened. They talked about it. They communicated about the trauma. Other participants refused to refused to comment on what they had endured. They would say things like, it's in my past, it's not my problem, and so they were silent. Curiously, children of both types of participants inherited this trauma, right? The communication, whether direct or sublimated, right, not spoken, impacted them. We also see that it's influenced by socio-ecological factors, and Dr. Crumpton talked about this some in passing this morning, and I think it's helpful to think about Uri Bronfenbrenner's ecological model here, these concentric circles that you see on the slide. Because what happened following this Rwandan genocide, just this one example, is that there were many indirect pathways that trauma was transmitted. So the economy fell, right? People fell into poverty. Individuals and families experienced so much death that the management of households got put upon fewer people. There were still all the things to do, but fewer people to do the do. And so the psychological impact resulted in greater depression, greater anxiety, diminished productivity. People experienced physical limitations, family conflict, substance abuse, difficulty parenting, and the list goes on. But when we see it through this model of the interaction between the microsystem, the exosystem, the mesosystem, and macrosystem, we see how those things happening in different layers of the culture impact the individual at the center and how they're mediated through those primary relationships. So an experience of trauma by one generation cascades down to those further generations. And I mentioned earlier that one of the distinguishing factors between stress and trauma, at least in regards to traditional definitions, is that somatic element, how we embody it. And trauma engenders such a unique neurobiological response. But even if the events that caused trauma did not cause bodily stress, that trauma is stored in the body, and it can manifest as physical symptoms. Emotional dysregulation, chronic pain, for example. But it can also impact brain function, particularly related to memory, to perception, to emotional regulation. This is true of all trauma, and this is why past traumas can be reactivated and compound, much the way we think of grief. Deborah Van Dusen Hunsinger, who's professor emerita at Princeton Theological Seminary, she wrote about an experience amid the pandemic. And she narrated how the COVID-19 pandemic, which taxed the nervous systems of so many of us, so many across the globe, became compounded by the murder of George Floyd, sending people into fight or flight. And I want to read you what she wrote on the impact on the body, because I think it translates to many other experiences that we have. She said, "The urgent need to take action comes about as the automatic nervous system goes on high alert. Stress hormones are released and the body prepares itself to fight the danger or to flee from it. We experience an elevated heart rate, difficulty in breathing, rising blood pressure, and an inability to stay warm. Our brains and nervous systems are finely tuned to perceive threat whenever it draws near. The vagal nerve that runs from the brainstem to the gut sends messages, primarily from the gut to the brain, whenever the body senses danger. And this happens in less than a split second. Every single experience from your past is stored in your body with an exquisite inner alarm system in place, priming you to flee, to fight, or, if those are not possible, to freeze. And the freeze reaction, which is immobilization, this shifts your consciousness dramatically. A kind of detachment sets in. Now, these experiences get encoded in our brains and our bodies, and they can be reactivated, like in PTSD, but they can also be passed down to future generations. Because our bodies are not our own. They're the bearers of history. They're impacted by the lives of creatures before us. And we know this anecdotally, but scientific research now indicates that children are impacted by parental trauma exposures that occur even before they're born, possibly even before they're conceived. This is supported by research in epigenetics that began in the late 1990s, and it demonstrates how environmental events can impact DNA methylation. So I'll give you one example. There was a study comparing DNA methylation rates within 32 Holocaust survivors and 22 of their surviving children in a control sample, versus a control sample. And the findings showed that the Holocaust survivors and their children showed changes in the FKBP5 gene. Now, what that gene does is it relates to PTSD and to depression. And that was demonstrated in this population in a way that was not seen within the control population. Now, the children were not themselves Holocaust survivors, but the epigenetic methylation of the DNA passed this on to future generations. So what does all this mean about how we think about trauma? Well, it is an ever-evolving concept. And so indiscriminately describing everything from the world's response to the COVID-19 pandemic to mass shootings as traumatic is arcane, inaccurate, and unhelpful. And notwithstanding the Western belief in the supremacy and universality of biomedical models of trauma, other cultures have valid ways of understanding and addressing the effects of extreme experiences, what we would call traumatic, as well as fostering resilience and growth. And theological and spiritual wisdom offer insights into how stressful and traumatic experiences can be both life-limiting and life-giving. that can be both despairing as well as the impetus for growth and resilience.
Wow.
So not all distress is trauma, nor should all distress be avoided. And PTSD, as it's defined in the DSM-5 TR, it doesn't encompass all forms of traumatic distress. And stress and trauma quite often co-occur with growth and resilience. And we're going to examine this a little bit through the scriptures in a minute. But stress and trauma exist on a continuum. It's not a hierarchy, and both are very deserving of care. So we play with words, right? We redefine, we reimagine what it means. But it helps us to think theologically about this. So before considering spiritual care for stress and trauma as an active resistance, I want to think a little bit theologically, and I'm going to do that from my own religious location as a Protestant Christian. So in the United States, the medicalization of distress is a cultural phenomenon, but it both influences and is influenced by Christian theological anthropology, as well as understandings of God and Jesus. Whether we heard it from a grandmother or a seminary professor, many of us are deeply aware that the notions of humankind fallen, sinful nature, and the idea that if it wasn't for our disobedience, human existence would be perfect, immortal, and most importantly, free from suffering and distress. This theology makes suffering not just unfortunate, but also a punishment to be avoided at all costs. And it's a de facto theology of distress in which we can become easily caught up in what is versus what we think should be. But this emphasis on humanity's fallen nature also contributes to the Christian tradition's focus on woundedness and the suffering of Christ and his followers. In 2 Corinthians, Paul attributed his own woundedness, a quote, thorn in the flesh, to God that he might be, quote, made perfect in weakness. So but the belief that wounds are a conduit to faith pervaded the life of the early church, particularly when people were enduring a lot of persecution. And in much of Christian theology, woundedness binds humans with one another in a common experience, but it also connects individuals to God through Christ. So the notion that suffering and trauma are inherent to the Christian journey is a part of many Christians' embedded theology. And regrettably, such theological perspectives are often used to normalize distress and trauma, because enduring suffering can be seen as just evidence of the faith. And identifying with the suffering Christ can be helpful, but it also leaves people in victimhood. It leaves them unable to envision horizons of hope. And life-limiting theologies and perspectives on suffering have been used to facilitate violence, abuse, oppression.
Oh my.
And the medicalization of distress has contributed to both implicit and explicit encouragement to take pride in the privilege of suffering as Christ suffered. For in doing so, we're joining with Christ. Now, these are traditional theologies of suffering, but there's a lot that's there beyond this. Empathizing with Jesus at the end of his life as he hung on the cross can undoubtedly be a great comfort to people experiencing distress, to victims of trauma, particularly those who may be awakening this for the first time, who feel alone or abandoned or misunderstood. But to stay in that place of woundedness, it risks condemning people to a life of victimhood, and it undermines this ongoing power of resurrection that recognizes growth in suffering. So identifying solely with Christ's wounded nature prevents one from becoming a victim survivor. And this is why the cross is only one end of this continuum in stress for Jesus. So I want to explore what this is, what this means. When we turn to the Christian scriptures with a little bit of a different hermeneutic or an alternate theology of trauma, we see other evidence for understanding trauma on a stress-trauma continuum. And in these narratives, suffering, stress, and trauma are not punishments for the sins of humanity, and Christ's role as Savior is enacted both through the life and his death. And in seeing it this way, resistance, resilience, and growth can all co-occur alongside stress and trauma. Now, this last point is really essential because often these days we think about trauma and resilience as dichotomous constructs, right? Dichotomous experiences. Resilience in many ways is considered like the defeat of trauma. It's an outcome. You overcame it, you bounced back. But scriptural and psychological wisdom shows us that resilience actually co-occurs alongside adversity. We see scriptural examples of this, and I want to share just 3. The first is consider how Jacob wrestled with the angel as recounted in Genesis. Jacob wrestled the angel, physically toiling throughout the night until the angel departed at daybreak. And he received a blow to the hip that wounded him, crippling him for the rest of his life. But alongside these scars, he received the new name, Israel, meaning one who struggles with God. And amid the trauma of his battle, a metaphorical and literal confrontation with his own growing edges and with God, Jacob was wounded and blessed by this struggle. Second example, the New Testament portrays Jesus time and time again with his, quote, back against the wall. In Jesus and the Disinherited, pastoral theologian and civil rights leader Howard Thurman reminds us of the essential fact that Jesus grew up and lived as a dark-skinned Jew under the oppression of the empire. And among all the interpretations of Jesus' life and death, the most important speak, as Thurman said, to those who stand at a moment in human history with their backs against the wall. So, we all know God didn't take on form as a Roman elite, right? God didn't take on form as the powerful. God took on form as a poor Jew. Jesus lived as an outcast facing oppression. He exercised power by choosing his response to the distresses of the world. And Jesus taught that the alleviation of distress or the eradication of injustice would not be enacted by laws, but by ethical practice of love, grounded in the love of God, other, and self. So this cross is only one end of the continuum of suffering and stress for Jesus and for all those living under the thumb of oppression. And although Jesus didn't call Christians to seek trauma and suffering, the scriptures definitely offer numerous examples of Jesus speaking transparently about the simultaneously arduous and blessed nature of discipleship. So think, for example, about the Beatitudes from the Gospel of Matthew. When Jesus said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." This wasn't actually foreshadowing an eschatological or otherworldly blessing. It was that the hungry are blessed already. And the struggle for right relationship and justice is both inherently distressing and generative. So when we think about stress and trauma, they often compel individuals and communities to look to potential futures as foreclosed. And this is because the oppressive present is all that can be conceived in any given moment. I think many of us can feel that today in ways under the current administration. We can't imagine what life after this will be, or tomorrow for that matter. But Jesus pushed back against the tyrannies of the present over the future by disrupting this temporal arc that threatens to maintain unjust structures forever and always. And when we understand trauma as part of the stress-trauma continuum, it challenges conceptions of trauma that consider it just the result of an acute event or a singular moment of injury, which helps us to shift from chronological time, our time, to kairos, right? God's time. And this invites us in pushing back, just as Jesus did, about the resignation of presentism. It's very easy today to think that what is will be, because it's what we know when we have a foreshortened or foreclosed future due to trauma. But when we embrace God's continuous engagement, these life-limiting oppressive forces get shifted. Resilience, when it's supported by and facilitated in community, can be experienced alongside suffering by many populations managing the effects of intergenerational trauma. I've already named the victims of genocide, but including genocidal rape, members of the LGBTQ+ queer communities, African Americans enduring the legacies of slavery in the United States, and more. In each of these examples, we see evidence of how social support is so crucial to resilience. It's not merely accompaniment, it's belonging. And belonging is made possible because humans attempt to include one another. But it's made possible by God, because belonging was God's desire for creation. God's desire was that humans experience this belonging with God and with one another in all creation. And that's where resilience comes from. So we see all this evidence of God meeting people in the wilderness of stress and trauma and emboldening them with spiritual tenacity and the courage to face finitude and to persevere. But God also created humans in this communal interdependence with belonging. And when we live out that innate belonging, then resilience is facilitated, not because we as an individual are resilient, but because we are in a community of belonging, and together we are resilient. So that resilience that co-occurs with stress and trauma comes from God and the way God created humans in relationship. It's not an outcome of event-based trauma. It's not a personality trait. And decades of empirical psychological research has attempted to identify the factors that facilitate resilience following exposure to potentially traumatic events. But more predictive than any personality trait or any demographic variable are social and economic resources, worldview, meaning making, right? These are the factors that help us to belong, that help us to be resilient. So in response to these insidious traumas of capitalism and colonialism, resilience is an act of resistance. But given the ruptures that we experience in our belonging, working to foster that resilience amid our stress and trauma and community becomes imperative. So how do we do this? We all do it very well already through spiritual care as resistance. But I want to offer some practices, bless you, many that we already do that make such an impact when navigating stress, trauma, and facilitating, fostering this resilience amid. So a reframed psychospiritual of trauma in a diseased world invites religious leaders, spiritual caregivers, and clinicians offering spiritually integrated psychotherapy and care to recognize the broad range of care receivers and clients' needs. Whether their experiences are more aptly termed distress or trauma, both necessitate care and intervention. But also to assist care receivers and clients in identifying language that accurately reflects their distress beyond the biases and fixed terminology of our trauma culture. We don't want to perpetuate the trauma industry. But we do want to acknowledge that oppression can, but does not always, have a traumatic effect, and that we need to create space for naming and experiencing it as such when it's relevant. We also need to avoid exporting Western biomedical conceptions of trauma and colonizing them with other cultures and contexts. And we would do well to be mindful of this and to take caution in our everyday discourse in how we talk about events occurring in contexts or cultures, particularly in intercultural relationships. We also can provide care receivers and clients with space to help shift these embedded theological understandings of trauma that center distress to the exclusion of hope, as well as understandings that center hope to the exclusion of distress, and help guide people toward more deliberative theologies that embrace both. So some ways that we can do this. When we think about spiritual care as an act of resistance, many of these practices are ones that we already do in our caregiving or counseling contexts, but I'm going to go through each of them and offer the ways that I see this as resistance to stress trauma. So first, Christian communities in churches, cities, villages, refugee camps, displacement camps all around the world turn to the Bible as solace. Traditions turn to their sacred scriptures. And this is one of the finest examples of how what Rebecca Chopp argued, the word serves as the perfectly open sign. Because when the details of our own trauma narratives become too difficult to voice, biblical stories of war, exile, violence, they can entail a sense of sustenance that helps us to find faith and hope. Brent Strawn reinterprets the purpose of many violent stories in the Old Testament and suggests that they act as detailed confessions that serve a collective purpose of naming in every gory detail the violence that's been endured and committed. And these biblical narratives of trauma, they don't always require words. In her book on Joy Unspeakable, Contemplative Practices in the Black Church, Barbara Holmes describes the contemplative practices in Black church that through generations have told the stories of violence, suffering, and survival. She notes, for example, the power of the ring shout during enslavement that could carry multiple layers of meaning from deliverance to disappointment to celebration of survival, in which the story is told not in words, but through a holy moving of the body. And she demonstrates how hope, courage, and resilience can co-occur with the intergenerational trauma of enslavement. She says of the ring shout, quote, "Stories of torture and oppression meant to discourage and create fear became the grist for storytellers who shared mythic narratives of courage. Even the very tools of torture were divested of their power through inversion and sacred ritual." So we can turn to biblical narratives of trauma to re-story in a way. But this is all part of meaning making, because restoring one's own trauma narrative by turning to any of the biblical narratives is one form of meaning making that facilitates resilience. Now, I'm not going to say that all experiences of stress and trauma should be reframed as opportunities for growth. That is not my point. But we do need to make meaning of those experiences. Psychologist Crystal Park argues that distress often results when the situational meaning that's been ascribed to an experience of stress or trauma doesn't align with our global meaning. So she writes, "Highly traumatic events are commonly appraised as unpredictable, unfair, and uncontrollable, and as having pervasive adverse implications for survivors and their futures. The meaning-making model asserts that distress is not generated by the appraised meaning itself, but rather by that discrepancy between the appraised meaning and the individual's global meaning system. So the greater that discrepancy, the greater the tension, the greater the perceived violation is. But we have the power to make the meaning that we want to make of it as individuals and as communities. So stress and trauma can, in ways, be life-giving. And this can be done by ascribing situational meaning to experiences that align with our global meaning systems. But sometimes we also have to reframe our global meaning systems too. Because when that discrepancy occurs between the situation and the global meaning, reducing this discrepancy leads to better adjustment and resilience. So for example, when we experience stress or trauma, it's not uncommon for people to also realize that they have strengths and skills and resources that they previously didn't know they had. You could be a child with many adverse childhood experiences, right? That could endure years of physical and psychological abuse, but that's also cultivated a lot of resilience amid the stress and trauma by appraising the abuse as an event that evidenced their inner grit, their strength. Again, it's not to take away the stress or trauma of that, but it's to say co-occurring alongside is this resilience and strength that you've also cultivated. One way that we can see this in ourselves and in generations before is through survival genograms. Many of us use genograms to look at family systems and explore, genetic histories as well as spiritual histories. But this methodology creates a pictorial version of the family tree to highlight relationship, health, psychological patterns. It shows us where some of this intergenerational trauma can come from. And the methodology helps children and grandchildren of survivors to explore ancestral lessons that may have been very important and life-giving in one context that may no longer have the same meaning. So for example, your grandmother, your great-grandmother could have been told, never let your guard down. And that could have been an adage or belief for her that was very life-giving in the context and time. But as it's been passed down, perhaps that's fear that's been given to you that's not relevant to you in your current context. So how do you track through the generations those experiences of stress and trauma? And because belonging is so important to cultivating resilience, collective restorative practices can help to heal both individual and intergenerational traumas. And this only comes about through the possibility of encounter. And these kinds of encounters can be very risky. They can be risky business because they're messy, they're often frustrating, and they put us in a vulnerable place. But Stephanie Edwards at Boston College proposes what she calls Christian enfleshed counter memory. Because we cannot keep recalling our own individual pasts. We must encounter others, even if it's risky, in our embodied natures, encounter oppressive, life-limiting memories with decolonial realities. So, to evidence this, Walter Brueggemann has a quote where he was referencing grief, but I think it transcends to this collective restorative practice of trauma. So I'll read this for you and substitute the word trauma with grief. The public dimension of trauma is deep underneath personal trauma, and for the most part, not easily articulated among us. But trauma will not be worked well or adequately until attention goes underneath the personal to the public and communal. My expectation is that pastors, liturgically and pastorally, most need to provide opportunity and script for lament and complain and trauma for a long time. We are in a moment where we should be engaging in and planning for collective restorative practices. Our personal narratives of trauma are not in isolation, they're in community. And the more we engage in this risky and vulnerable business of coming together to share these, to name these, the greater the resilience and growth will be. Another practice is to reimagine the divine, because this can serve as a powerful way for providing spiritual care for stress and trauma. We all have God images that are influenced by scripture and tradition, by culture, but also through our own psychology and lived experience. So I included an image here of this book, The Birth of a Living God, a classic by Anna Maria Rizzuto. But she explains from a psychoanalytic perspective the origins, development, and use of our God images. Scholar Janet Jacobs embarked on a qualitative study with 50 descendants of the Holocaust to explore how intergenerational trauma impacted their views of the divine. And what she found was that when faced with socio-emotional inheritance of generational trauma, the realm of the sacred became a site for transformation. So of these 50 participants in the study, all children of Holocaust survivors, many began to reimagine the divine in ways not traditional to Judaism, regardless of whether they themselves practiced the faith. Some cultivated an individual relationship with a higher power, rather than a patriarchal guide who they saw as failing to protect their parents. Whereas others saw God as a spiritual protector who spared their parent or parents as part of a master plan. And many viewed the divine as intentionally not gendered and as a comfort rather than a powerful being. So in all these unique ways, these survivors' children, whether they identified as Jewish or not, they reimagined in the divine in ways that gave meaning to their own stress, to their own trauma that they had inherited. Finally, many of us are familiar with the literature on post-traumatic growth, but this also suggests that growth can co-occur with suffering. So post-traumatic growth, or PTG, is similar to resilience, but there are two things that are not the same. Pastoral theologian Mary Beth Wardell helps us to understand several things about post-traumatic growth. The first is that while resilience can be present from the earliest moments and onward through stress and trauma, growth requires time and reflection. So we're not going to see this co-occurring. And Wardell likens this to the growth of wisdom. She states, "The road to wisdom is not one in which a person in darkness can focus solely on light, nor is wisdom found by trying to make darkness light. Rather, traumatic growth is seen only by allowing dark and light to coexist, recognizing how they correlate and finding a way to synthesize new meanings. For some people, this newly synthesized meaning leads to growth." So some of us might see the language around light and dark, associations of good and bad, as being unfortunate, but her point is very well taken, because post-traumatic growth can be liberating. But one need not believe that that growth can happen only in some far out horizon or after some destination of healing has been met, because resilience is not an outcome. And PTS, or post-traumatic growth, can help build that resilience. It can help to foster that sense of wisdom after we make meaning of what the distress and trauma is. None of this is an attempt to abolish or to reframe diagnostic conceptualizations of trauma. The DSM-5 TR is in place for a reason, and we need definitions of PTSD. We also need medical interventions. It's also not an attempt to abolish any sort of systematic theology of trauma. But what it is an attempt to say, there's a push and a pull between psychology and theology that's happening around this term. And as we practice language care, it's important that we don't capitulate to the trauma industry and call everything distressing traumatic. So as we think about how we can practice spiritual care as resistance, one of the first things we can do is to not play the language game. But we also have a unique opportunity to help people to discern what is distress and what is trauma, to recognize ways that trauma might not be medicalized, but is very palpable within our culture, and then to help people to see, ourselves included, the resilience, the strength, the grit, the growth that's already there, even amid the distress and trauma. Thank you very much.